I'm going to start by introducing our speakers. We have two wonderful speakers today. Both of them are full of wit and charm, as you'll soon see. Josh Blackman, who's our guest, is a graduate of George Mason Law School, where he was the articles editor. He clerked for the Western District of Pennsylvania, out in the middle of nowhere, and for Judge Danny Boggs in Louisville, which is slightly less the middle of nowhere. He's written articles on all sorts of subjects, including one I thought was most interesting was Pearson v. Post and the Natural Law, which I'll have to take a look at later. He's probably best known as a prolific blogger at joshblackman.com. He's also the founder of the Harlan Institute and the founder of FantasyScotus.net, which is a Supreme Court fantasy league. So go ahead and sign up for that while you're watching the presentation. His book is unprecedented. If you missed that, it's here. There should be copies for sale. The bookstore was supposed to be here to sell them. She's right there with a stack of books. So they are here to sell them. And Professor Blackman will be happy to sign your books after the event. Professor Ruger, our very own. When Professor Blackman went to Yale, they put Jack Balkan up against him. But I thought we should get someone who could actually give him a run for his money. So we got Professor Ruger, who is an expert in all sorts of things, including con law, admin law, healthcare law. So he's really well suited to this. He clerked for Judge Boudin in the First Circuit and for Justice Stephen Breyer at the Supreme Court. He also was a litigation associate at Williams & Connolly for 2 years. He's been visiting professor at Harvard and at Yale, and we're very lucky to have him here as a full-time faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Blackman. Okay.
All right, how's everyone doing today? Good, good. Semester going well? Very good. All right, so my name is Josh Blackman. Thank you all very much. Thank you to Lee and everyone at the Federal Society at Penn for bringing me in. This talk today is going to be something a little bit different. How many of you actually studied the healthcare cases in con law? Okay, how many are familiar with the Obamacare cases? Okay, good chunk. So the book I wrote, Unprecedented, is not just a story about what the Supreme Court decided in the case. It's much, much more than that. This book tells the story of how the challenge came to be. So my plan for today is to first give you a brief overview of the case, and then give you some of the inside stories of how the lawyers came back to challenge it. And then Professor Ruger and I will have a little bit of a discussion and some questions about how this case came about, because he also followed it very closely. All right, so, and I hope my presentation doesn't crash while I'm talking about Obamacare, but we have to, it's remarkable though. When I sent this book to press last July, I thought this case was over. I thought Obamacare was a done deal, it's the law of the land, no problem. But I've just been stunned with how this issue has remained salient. And I think in order to understand a lot of the issues we have today, we have to go back to 2009 when the law was passed. So at the outset, what is the Affordable Care Act? Well, it was this massive healthcare reform that was meant to make healthcare more affordable and more available to people. And how does it do this? Well, a couple ways. It makes the insurers not able to deny coverage to people with pre-existing conditions and tries to lower prices. Now, has it lowered prices of health insurance? Well, it does it by expanding the insurance pool. What does this mean? Insurance was expensive because usually people are very ill and sick use it more than young, healthy people like you. Most of the people in this room are young and healthy and probably have very minimal coverage, if any at all. So what the Affordable Care Act says, listen, in order to make healthcare more affordable for these sick people, let's bring you young and healthy people into this insurance market. Now, how do we bring people to the market? Something called a mandate. What did the mandate do? It said, okay, you have to buy health insurance. You have to buy some plan. If you don't, you pay a penalty. So the goal of Obamacare at the outset was to bring people into the healthcare market. What we're seeing now is that young people are not signing up yet, and there's a fear of something called an adverse selection death spiral, which basically means if you have all these sick people in the insurance market and not enough healthy young people to balance it out, the market collapses. Okay, so that was the basis of Obamacare. But one of the main issues of why Obamacare was so tricky was how it brought all these young people to the market. So there's something called an individual mandate. You've all heard of the mandate, I'm guessing? What the mandate does, as it was originally structured, was it says, you shall maintain insurance, meaning you shall keep health insurance, and if you don't, you pay this penalty to the IRS, right? This was a way to force people, we use a Cass Sunstein word, nudge people to having health insurance, so it was probably more of a shove than a nudge. But what was unique about this law? What was unique was this was probably one of the first times that Congress had actually compelled people to buy a healthcare product. Okay? And this was the genesis of the challenge. Now, you've all studied in common law cases like Wicker v. Filburn and Gonzalez v. Raich. And Congress has very broad powers to regulate interstate commerce, even if the activity is within one state. But the argument began that this case was different. It was, dare I say, unprecedented. So I'll take you back roughly, I guess now 4 years ago, to the 2009 Federal County Lawyers Convention at the Mayflower. And by the way, this is not necessarily a plug for FedSoc, but go to these conventions, walk around the halls, because really cool stuff happens at these meetings. But I was at the convention, I was walking through the halls, and I bumped into a couple of lawyers, one named Todd Gaziano, who's at Heritage, and a few others. And they were talking about this healthcare law. This law hadn't even cleared the Senate, it was still kind of its nascent stages. And we were talking about this law, saying, hey, is there anything we can do to challenge it constitutionally? I said, what are you talking about? This is regulating 1/6 of the United States economy. This is an obvious regulation of interstate commerce. This is patently constitutional. But they're saying, no, there's something different about this law. It's not regulating commerce, it's regulating no commerce, right? That this law only kicks in when a person decides not to buy health insurance. And this argument shapes that, saying, this is different. This is not telling us we have to do something differently if we're engaging in commerce, but if we are doing nothing, we have to engage in commerce. Okay? So we were having this conversation. It didn't really go anywhere. And then Randy Barnett walks by, and maybe you probably know Randy. He's a big mata at Georgetown. He's this massive common law professor who became the icon of this case. And then Todd goes to Randy, hey, Randy, what do you think about this challenge to the Affordable Care Act? And he's like, I haven't given it much thought. I mean, this is Randy saying, I just haven't given it much thought. And this is Randy arguing Gonzalez v. Raich. But Todd and Randy start talking back and forth. They put together this white paper for Heritage. And this white paper for Heritage made a very unique argument. The argument was, all other cases that the Supreme Court's decided to regulate commercial activity. If you read, for example, Gonzalez v. Raich, the medicinal marijuana case, uses the word activity over and over again. This case, they argued, was different. It regulates inactivity. In other words, my decision to do nothing is being regulated. If I choose to not buy insurance, Congress is coercing me to do it. And the argument went, this violates the Commerce Clause. Congress lacks the power to do this. Needless to say, I'm sure Professor Ruger will agree, this argument was laughed at by common law professors. Professor Ruger, did you laugh at that argument when you first heard it?
I did. I didn't make any offer to eat hats or anything, but
well, okay.
Like my professor, pretty nice.
For example, his professor, Charles Freed, who was a former Reagan Solicitor General, said he would eat his kangaroo hat, a kangaroo skin hat, if the Supreme Court ever bought this argument. It was so silly. By the way, do you know that Charles actually had a baker make a hat out of like frosting that he would have eaten? But
I didn't know until I looked at your book.
The reason why you should read it. So anyway, this argument was crazy. This argument was crazy. No one bought it. But something very interesting happened. So at the same time that Randy and these other guys were making these arguments, a number of Republican state attorneys general were also figuring out how to challenge this law. This is what actually made the challenge kick. This wasn't some article written by Randy Barnett. You had eventually 26 state attorneys general, basically all the states that voted for John McCain. All these states came together and they said, we need to challenge this law. But what's interesting, though, is that the mandate, right, applies to individuals. Why were the states challenging laws that only affects individuals? Well, the real reason states were involved was because of the other part of the law, which we don't talk about, the Medicaid expansion. These states opposed Obamacare because it would expand Medicaid to those at 133% of poverty level. And although the feds paid for it for the first few years, the states were worried that eventually this would bankrupt the states. So you had these two forces. You had a bunch of these rogue libertarian law professors coming together with these ideas, and you had these Republican state attorneys general who had a lot of political gain to be had by going after this law. Among others, Ken Cuccinelli in Virginia, Governor, well, then Attorney General Corbett, now Governor Corbett. These are people who saw they could make serious political gain by attacking this law. So within minutes, actually I think 7 minutes after Obama's signature dried on the Affordable Care Act, actually the ink wasn't even dry yet, they filed lawsuits across the country. And these lawsuits were never thought to be having a chance of success. This was thought to be laughers, jokes of lawsuits. But something interesting happened, and I talked about this with the Jack at Yale, but the people started kind of accepting this idea. And we forget a lot about the Tea Party. They're not heard from too much today, unless the IRS audits their tax returns or something. But this was a very prominent, powerful force back in 2009, 2010. And the Tea Party almost exclusively rallied around this one concept, that we need to stop Obamacare. And they didn't just oppose it on policy grounds, they opposed it on constitutional grounds, what some might call a popular constitutionalist argument, that because the people can actually inform what the Constitution means. And even more remarkably, judges bought this. You had a judge in Florida, Judge Vincent, you had a judge in Virginia, Judge Hudson. They actually accepted the Obamacare argument, saying why this is unconstitutional. And this made an argument that was at first crazy and ludicrous, as Professor Ruger was chuckling before, seemed legitimate. And this argument kept developing and refining all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court, though, things got very interesting. Now I'll give you some really good inside baseball of how this case was actually argued. For this book, I interviewed just about everyone. People in the Justice Department, the most senior ranks. I interviewed all the lawyers who argued the case, from Clement to Carvin, everyone down. So I basically know how all the arguments were framed. So let me set the debate for you. There are a few main issues that the court had to decide in this case. The first one was, is the mandate constitutional? And there were two possible grounds on which the mandate could be saved. The first ground, which I already mentioned, is the Commerce Clause, right? Congress has the power to regulate commerce and can choose how you finance your health insurance. They can decide you will pay for your health insurance now rather than paying for health care later. Okay, so that was one argument. The second possible ground to save the law was Congress's power to lay and collect taxes. So, for example, Social Security is a program supported by payroll tax. If any of you have received a paycheck, you see this little line that says Social Security tax. That's how it's funded. But there was a problem with the Affordable Care Act. When the law was being enacted and debated, it was not called a tax. It was called a penalty. That's what it was labeled as. The president made it very clear that this wasn't a tax. Democrats made it clear this wasn't a tax. Why? Well, who wants to raise taxes? So they called it a penalty. But as soon as the litigation began, they switched their positions. Oh, no, now it's a tax. And I'll give you a little bit more inside baseball. At first, the White House didn't even want to argue in court that it was a tax. In fact, it was actually Neil Katyal who had to write a letter to the White House counsel begging and saying, we need this arrow in our quiver. We need to be able to argue this law as a tax. So actually, even in the early days, the administration was trying to mess with the arguments. But they said, fine, call it a tax in court. Okay? But there was another problem. So who here has actually heard of the Tax Anti-Injunction Act? Anyone? Okay, like 3 people. So, generally, if you have beef with the IRS and you think they're assessing a tax incorrectly, you have to pay it. And then you sue later. You're not allowed to say, hey, IRS, let me sue you in court, hold this up for 10 years, and then maybe pay it later. No. The way the Tax Anti-Injunction Act works is that actually divests courts of jurisdiction to hear tax disputes until you've paid it and gone through the full administrative processes and various appeals. So, if the Affordable Care Act was actually a tax, which would not be enforced until 2014, soon, unless it's delayed, this could not be argued in court. In other words, court would actually lack jurisdiction, or it would be moot, or maybe it wouldn't be right yet, depending how you look at it. But there was a problem. The administration wanted this case to be heard now. Why? Well, imagine, if you will, history went differently. Mitt Romney won. Can you imagine the Romney administration arguing in court to support Obamacare? Of course not. They would probably just sit down and say, hey, all yours, guys, take care of it. So the administration says we have to resolve it now. And there are less cynical reasons. There's a lot of implementation that has to be done. I think they had a website they have to build, and they needed adequate time to make sure the website was built in time. Slightly facetious, but these are things they had to actually do. So, what's the problem? If you argue it's a tax, the court lacks jurisdiction. Okay? If you don't argue it's a tax, you lose perhaps in Commerce Clause. So the Solicitor General, who actually is kind of bum-rapped, was really, really bright. And he thought of a way to possibly save this law. Now, in the lower courts, they all argued, well, even though it's not called a tax, you should treat it as a tax. But he looked at it a little bit differently. He said, listen, for purposes of the Tax Anti-Injunction Act, Congress can define their own jurisdictional rules. Of course they can call something a tax or not, that doesn't matter. That's totally separate from the constitutional inquiry of taxing, which is much broader. Okay? But here's where it gets good. What he told the court was, if you can construe a penalty as a tax to save it, then it should be constitutional. So, who here remembers the case New York versus United States? This was the radioactive waste case, or the 10th Amendment case you might have studied. You all studied in common law, maybe not. But there was one paragraph in that case that proved pivotal. It was an opinion by Justice O'Connor, where there was effectively a penalty that was placed in the state of New York to take care of certain kind of radioactive waste. It wasn't really important. But O'Connor said in her opinion that if we can construe this penalty that forces New York to take this waste as a tax, To save its constitutionality, we shall do so. Let's say that again. If you construe a penalty as a constitutional tax, we have an obligation to do so. This was the exact argument that Verrilli made to John Roberts. Okay? So for all these people who think that John Roberts pulls his opinion out of whole cloth, no. He took almost verbatim the Solicitor General's representation of how to frame this issue. And in the John Roberts opinion, so-called saving construction came right from Verrilli's brief. In oral arguments, he said over and over again, the reasonable way to read this is a tax. The best way to read this is a tax. And combined with his Anti-Injunction Act argument, he actually threaded the needle. I talked to people in DOJ, they said this problem was one of nomenclature. They actually didn't see this as big of a problem, and they were right. But where they lost, though, is largely their own fault. They lost on the Medicaid issue. So, originally when the healthcare law was being passed, states basically were not given a choice. Governor Jan Brewer of Arizona wrote a letter to HHS, Health Human Services, and said, hey, what happens if we don't want to participate in this Obamacare program? Do we have to lose all of our funding? And some low-level wonk at CMS wrote back and said, hey, if you don't take the money for Obamacare, you will lose all of your Medicaid funding, all $8 billion. So in other words, if Arizona doesn't participate in this one program, they stand to lose their entire Medicaid budget, which would have been staggering. Okay? So during the oral arguments, John Roberts and also Elena Kagan and Stephen Breyer were pressing on the Solicitor General saying, hey, you gave the states an ultimatum to either accept this Obamacare money or lose everything. Isn't this coercion under the spending doctrine? You can't place strings on it. And interestingly enough, the Solicitor General knew this argument was coming. He knew this Arizona letter was there. And he said, basically, this is above my pay grade. And actually, your former boss, Justice Breyer, said, did you not see this question coming? Oh, he knew the question was coming. But here's where politics kicks in again. HHS would not give him permission to say no. HHS would not allow him to say that we won't take away all of your money. In other words, Sebelius, right? She wanted to maintain the authority to take away all the funding from the states. This is where politics and law clashes. So Verrilli was up there looking like a fool, but he was no fool. He knew this question was coming, and he had to just tap dance around it. It's not surprising then that he lost on that exact issue. So the two main representations from the government, one, that this is simply a tax with no consequences, there's no actual penalty, won him on one issue. But the inability of the government to argue that there was not this gun to the head, that they wouldn't lose all their funding, really hurt them on the Medicaid argument. So this is, I guess, an abject kind of meta lesson for all of you law students. These cases argued by the government are not argued to win, necessarily. They're argued based on the institutional interest of the United States government. And there are a lot of meetings. I mean, I talked to people at DOJ who had these meetings with the heads of tax, the heads of Treasury, the heads of HHS, and they're all fighting. For example, the issue I mentioned before where they said the Anti-Injunction Act doesn't apply, Treasury opposed that vociferously. Why? Because they didn't want all these idiots suing them for their tax returns, right? By waiving the Anti-Injunction Act in this case, they were going to be opening themselves up to a lot more lawsuits. In fact, 2 former commissioners of the Internal Revenue Service filed an amicus brief against the government saying that your reading's wrong. And somewhere inside baseball, they actually, the Solicitor General severely discouraged the commissioners from filing this amicus brief, but they did it anyway. So saying, we don't want you mucking it up. So here we are today, again, with the Affordable Care Act, and I'll give you even a more salient thing. I actually have an op-ed with Randy Burnett that might be coming out this week on this point. Okay, so there's talk now of delaying the Obamacare mandate. Everyone's seen this, right? It's not, the websites aren't working, people will not be able to sign up in time. Okay? But the question to be asked is, what exactly are you delaying? Are you delaying a penalty? Or are you delaying a tax? If they're delaying a penalty, then it's unconstitutional. Roberts said, for 5 members, that a penalty that forces you to buy insurance is unconstitutional. But if it's a tax, then it will be constitutional. But Congress should be on record saying this is actually a tax we're delaying. And more importantly, the CBO should rescore it as a tax, because when this law was passed in 2010, it was scored by the Congressional Budget Office as a penalty, and the impact on taxpayers is not assessed. So these issues are still going to keep popping up, as well as the Medicaid issue. The reason why these exchanges by the federal government are failing is because states are not participating on their own accord. This was a discretion the Supreme Court gave them. So the main reason why HHS had to set up so many exchanges by themselves, the HHS had to set up so many exchanges for states, was because the Supreme Court gave states the option of not participating. That wasn't seen as a consideration back in 2009. That's why I think you had to vote with Michael Cannon last week on the same point. the entire Obamacare was premised on all the states being in. They didn't think any state would not be in it. Anyway, so the legal, the constitutional, and the politics of this case are simply staggering. And I thought this case was done, but I think we're going to be dealing with this throughout 2014, and I think even 2016. Okay? So you want to have a little discussion? Come up. Ted Ruger, come on down.
Well,
If I talk more from the Price is Right.
thank you, Josh.
My pleasure.
So I do want to have a discussion, and more of a discussion than a debate, mainly because I think this is a spectacular book, and not the least of which reason is having studied this and worked on this issue as an academic and talked about it as a talking head on the news last summer, etc. I learned more from this book about things I didn't know about this litigation, and I thought I knew this litigation, than I have from any single source I've read. So, point one is this is a great book. It's kind of a must-read for anybody who wants to understand this. I learned a ton, and I highly recommend it. Point two, I saw Josh. Josh has been in Philadelphia now for a few days. We had a big conference here Friday and Saturday, a great conference on empirical legal studies with 300 or 400 people here. And we talked a bit about what we wanted to talk about Monday, and one thing I think we both emphatically agreed on is we didn't want to talk that much about the Commerce Clause. And what I mean by, in a sense, we're happy to talk about the doctrine, happy to answer questions. I know that Josh and I disagree on the doctrinal niceties. But at this point, as we look back at the case, what's much more fascinating to me, and what I'll talk about in a few minutes, and then hopefully we can talk more interactively, is the broader context in which constitutional doctrine is shaped. So this is obviously a key case study. This book illustrates this case study, but this is a phenomenon that you could go all the way back to Marbury versus Madison and see that constitutional law is not shaped in a vacuum. It is shaped by the parties around it, and this tells the story of the way lawyers shape constitutional law, and in some cases very young lawyers, and indeed I'll say more about that, but it's a, whether you agree or not with the Supreme Court decision, whether you agree or not, and I did not and do not with the constitutional theory of the challengers, it's a heartening story to me of the way that, frankly, lawyers can influence law. That we saw in the civil rights movement from a different perspective, that we're seeing today with the movement for same-sex marriage around the country, that we're seeing in the gun rights movement. You name different sides of the political spectrum. It's a phenomenon of putting intelligent pressure on our legal structures, and lo and behold, our understanding of law changes. And this tells that story very clearly. So at this point, to me, that's a much more enduring lesson even than the kind of doctrinal niceties of the Commerce Clause, and something that when I teach when we law professors teach in a core first-year common law class or something, we don't focus on enough. We make sure you know that, elements of the Commerce Clause. Next time I teach this, I'll teach it a little differently in light of the Sebelius decision. But it's clearly, we ought to emphasize more the way that law is shaped, and this book tells that story. Going back, and I have been really involved in this, I guess, from the beginning, and emphatically not as an insider. I was not one of those law profs who went off to work in Washington. I didn't get invited, but I did get invited to go to Harvard, to teach at Harvard Law School in 2009, 2010, and it's telling, then as now, I like to participate in Federalist Society events, and I did a big debate at some point in that year with Richard Epstein, obviously a Fed Society regular. No offense, Josh, I was a little more intimidated with Professor Epstein. It was hard. But he's great, brilliant, levied, and it was a debate, like debating the Affordable Care Act, yada. And it was either right before or right after it passed. Not a word from him about the Commerce Clause or the Constitution. And believe me, he had lots of words about every other frailty of the Act and the way it would over-regulate and mess up the healthcare system. And we were back and forth. It was a fun debate. Not a peep about the mandates on constitutionality. So not just liberal law professors didn't recognize it, even mainstream elite conservatives. In fact, maybe you can say a little more about that, Josh, that this was a particular creative cohort, or just a small group of people at the Federalist Society convention. So this book tells the story, good reason to go to the convention. Ideas can be born there. That even a lot of other real heavyweight conservatives and opponents of the Act, like Epstein, weren't really thinking about it. And so we've moved, obviously, a long way from there. to amplify a few more points, and then we'll, we should go back to more discussion and bring you all into it. But, as I said, this illustrates the way that new legal ideas, forcefully or strategically then conceived, brilliantly operationalized as kind of doctrinal arguments and then forcefully litigated, can succeed in changing constitutional culture. And what are some of the elements of that? You have to have the idea generation. I'll say a couple words about that. You have to link it to doctrine. I think that's important. You have to, at some point, and maybe this overlaps with the first two in terms of temporal dynamics, you want to have this kind of networking and the connections that bring legal minds who might not have met together, and obviously this national group is a big part of that. And then you have to leverage the decentralized nature of the U.S. court system, the fact that there's multiple lower courts that might come out differently. We see that in this litigation. And then you have to kind of measure it, as we do now a year hence from the decision, the way that the way that the constitutional conversation, and I would say more than that, even constitutional law can be changed, even in what may technically look like a defeat for the opponents in this case. But we live in a different constitutional law culture today than we did a few years ago because of that, at least on a couple of dimensions. Now those generic points, idea generation, linking to doctrine, developing a network, decentralized diffuse litigation, changing the constitutional culture, on a general level, could be applied to same-sex marriage. It could be applied to, again, things that have been litigated could be applied in a sense to the opposition to eminent domain that flowed after the Kelo decision. It could be applied to other things. So this is a phenomenon that this case illustrates, but is not, in that sense, this is one area in which I think that the title is not accurate in describing this phenomenon. Indeed, this is just another cyclical thing here. That's not fair. You don't use it in that term. But just a couple more words. So first about the ideas. I mean, this one thing, although I disagree with the idea, this is this challenge to the individual mandate is an opposition grounded in principle, not interest group politics. Indeed, one reason I kind of support the mandate is it's really not in anybody's interest in general not to do it, or you can pay the tax, etc. In other words, this is not constitutional law that's generated by one or another group being heavily oppressed or overregulated in ways that hurt their pocketbook or something like that. Okay, and we can talk more about what the mandate means, etc. But most people, and put it bluntly, most lawyers out front opposing the mandate had mandates applied. They either would have chosen to buy health insurance, or they work for employers that encompassed in their paycheck includes a mandate to purchase health insurance. Anybody who works for a large employer today that provides health insurance faces an implicit mandate to purchase health insurance. You can't opt in, for most large employers, you can't opt out of a significant chunk of your paycheck going toward your purchase of health insurance. So this is something we do. Most of us have insurance, most of us choose it, but it's this ideational objection, not ideological, ideational objection, the idea that the government power is unlimited, that I think drove this litigation, and indeed, I think as Josh's book points out, indeed was a major frailty of supporters of the act to articulate a convincing limiting principle in response to judicial question. So the ideas are out there. I can say more, we could talk more about things like broccoli, and the rhetorical linkage of those ideas. I think the link to the idea to two things. First, popular rhetoric. Second, doctrine, which I think were quite different, and indeed I think served the opposition. The fact that the popular understanding of the mandate and the broccoli issue were different than the careful doctrinal statement. So if you ask the public, what does this mean? I guarantee you they would say, this means that, if we let this happen, the government can make you eat broccoli. And that would really be helpful, right? But that's not what Josh's book says, that's not what the brief said, and of course it all is in that little word. Okay, the government could make you buy broccoli, and you can throw it right in the trash, just like we did when our kids with the broccoli on the plate. You never have, there's no threat to bodily integrity, there's no threat to, your liberty as a human being. We're talking about money, Okay, in fact, we probably pay a broccoli mandate today in our federal taxes that then goes to subsidize broccoli growers through the Department of Agriculture. I actually don't know that. I haven't looked. I do know we pay huge, there's a wheat mandate, there's a pork mandate, there's a sugar mandate, right? We pay for that, and compulsory taxes, if you will, okay? But nobody has to eat those things. But yeah, if you listen to the public rhetoric, clearly put it this way, the opposition to the mandate became viewed as a greater threat to liberty than the actual statute said it was, and that's part of the success of the movement there. But then, that wasn't going to fly with smart federal judges, okay? So you had to have a much more precise doctrinal leverage, and here I think that and Josh, your book talks about this, you could maybe say more about this key innovation that said, aha, this is new, although the Commerce Clause is expansive, this is new because it regulates inaction instead of action. So there's this core distinction between action and inaction. I don't buy it metaphysically. Much smarter people than me, and here I would mostly cite Jeff Sutton doesn't buy it, and his Sixth Circuit concurrence is the best written deconstruction of the action distinction I've seen, and far more so than any academic. You know that case well, I know. So, and I won't go into it here, but frankly, many judges did buy it. Certainly, even Chief Justice Roberts bought it, and that was a key decision and innovation. And maybe you could say a little more about how that was framed intellectually. So you have these lawyers meeting. The networking component I won't belabor, but it's a compelling story in the book. Meeting together at the Federal Society Convention and other venues that bring these minds together who are working on this, and that story pervades Josh's book. And then I think this is important, the way cases are litigated in the U.S. Unlike other countries, there's other countries today where major questions like this of huge national importance could just be certified directly to the High Court, straight to the Supreme Court, okay? And this is where, these dry doctrines that we sometimes study in Civ Pro, Fed Court, standing, case of controversy, and the structures of, I think it's important for the development of constitutional change that cases start small and they start in different lower courts, different judges kind of experimenting with things, and then you could see that through this litigation, the fact that there were multiple things. The other implication that, Josh, that you could say more about is the people who start with this oppositional idea, they don't control, there's no trademark or, patent rights on this idea. So you had other people jumping in, Ken Cuccinelli, the Virginia AG, the Thomas More Law Center, and I'd love to hear more about the original group and some of their maybe dismay at these parallel lawsuits. And you see that with the same-sex marriage litigation. Okay, there's some people pushing ahead faster than others in ways that the elite proponents of same-sex marriage who have controlled the litigation that got to the Supreme Court in the recent Windsor and Perry are a little dismayed at some of the new claims that are being pushed forward. But you know what? This is the diffuse nature of American constitutional litigation. Even the ones who, the elites who oppose, they lose control of the idea. And this is a key part of our culture that we see across different things. And then again, I think that, and this is Jack Balkin's point, but I agree with it. The opponents of the individual mandate succeeded in changing the constitutional conversation, but again, I think I would say more than that, and I suspect Balkin does, really changing our constitutional law, because constitutional law, in a sense, which changes all the time, is really defined as what is perceived as acceptable, plausible, and indeed backed. Of course, you want to see it backed doctrinally by the court, which on the Commerce Clause issue now, there's 5 votes for the notion that Congress may not regulate inaction. I think I want to keep talking a lot more, but the last thing I'll say before I sit down with Josh and talk more with all of you is this kind of puts the lie to 2 different things. It puts the lie to sometimes the notion that our Constitution is kind of frozen in time or static, certainly not frozen in time in an originalist conception. We see constitutional meaning changing. But I would also say, in my view, it repudiates at least one conception of this label, living constitutionalism, because to me at least that connotes the notion that the Constitution has a life of its own, or is animated kind of internally, which I think is emphatically false. I think what this shows is the constitutional meaning changes, but it changes with it changes due to pressure from actors in the constitutional space, motivated from whatever ideological viewpoint to try to come up with good ideas, translate them into doctrine, and then put pressure through the courts in our constitutional litigation system, and that clearly is what happened here, I think. So, so that's certainly all I want to say right now. And Josh, you respond to some of those things, but then I think we'd like to have a conversation with all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Ted. This was very, very gracious. Those very kind words you said in my book. He actually told me a funny story that he was actually with CBS on Decision Day at the Supreme Court.
On the roof of Jones Day.
On the roof of Jones Day, which is about 2 blocks away from the Supreme Court. And I didn't mention this in my original talk, but when the case was first decided, let me stand up, this is blocking me. When the case was first decided, no one knew what actually happened. Okay, there are no cameras in the Supreme Court, right? There are no cameras. So the only way people know what happens is by literally having a runner go to the court, grab a copy of the 200-page opinion, and then run out. You actually see this, you have the animated GIFs now, of course, of these interns in sneakers running at full speed. Okay, so what happens? The case is announced, and Roberts are entering the opinion in the court, but outside the court, the Public Information Office releases the opinions, and someone runs and gets the opinion, and they run to the reporter on the street. Her name was Kate Baldwin for CNN, and you can see her looking at page 3 of the syllabus. I can tell this because there's video of it. On page 3, the Chief Justice says the mandate is unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause, right? So she's reporting to Wolf Blitzer, the mandate's unconstitutional, right? CNN blasts to their millions and millions of watchers, the mandate is unconstitutional. Guess who's watching CNN? Oh, guess who usually learns stuff from cable news about important national affairs? Yeah, the president. Yeah. So the president was actually watching CNN, and he's going, oh my God, how did I lose? How did I lose? And there was a solid 5 minutes where the president thought his own law was struck down. And eventually his White House counsel said, no, you lost. She gave him 2 thumbs up. It's like, but CNN said I lost. No, you won. But the funny part was, had Kate Baldwin turned to page 4 of the syllabus, she would have seen the sentence that says, but it's constitutional as a tax. So Ted was on the roof of CBS News, and I think they were just reading SCOTUS blog, trying to figure out what happened. But there was serious confusion. Okay? So, funny vignette, there are lots of good stories. So let me respond to a few points. You're absolutely right. When this case first started, if I remember correctly, Richard Epstein said it was a taking. That was his argument? I think that he had
I don't remember that.
Yeah, so Richard thinks everything's a taking.
Yeah,
but Richard,
that's right.
He's never found something that wasn't a taking. So Richard said it was a taking, and Richard, I think, had some sort of IRS tax argument or whatever. But this was generally laughed at. Law professors scoffed at the idea that something that regulates 1/6 of the U.S. economy could be unconstitutional. It was just a laugher. But I think there's something important in that. By laughing at it, and with all credit to professors on the other side, they weren't coming up with arguments against it, right? So I'm sure if any of you comment on internet message boards, you know that the easiest way to lose is just to laugh at someone, call them an idiot. Well, a law professor basically said these people were idiots. Chemerinsky, Akil Amar, and others, they basically said these arguments are stupid, they're dumb, they're ludicrous. They'll never gain any steam. But rather than coming up with any substantive arguments of why they're wrong, they just label them dumb and bad arguments. And I think this was very short-sighted, and I think this is a lesson to be learned for the future. Don't underestimate a constitutional challenge that's backed by half of the population. This is what Professor Ruger mentioned about the Constitution being connected to the people. When the people are rallying around a constitutional ideal, and there's a doctrinal argument for it. This isn't just saying they can't make us eat broccoli. There's actually a legitimate reading of Gonzalez v. Race to say why this is not activity. That's when you go up to the races. And this is also an argument about how all of you should really think that scholarship is worthwhile. Do you know who came up with the argument activity versus inactivity, or what first appeared? Does anyone know? A note in the Case Western Law Review. A guy named Nathaniel Stewart, he said with John Adler at Case Western, after race, he wrote a note. And the point of the note was saying, hey, wait a minute, Scalia keeps using the word activity over and over again, right? So I guess we can say that the Commerce Clause is regulated to commercial activity. That didn't make any sense until this happened, but he had that framework there, right? And Nate Stewart worked for Todd Gaziano, who was at Heritage. And Todd Gaziano knew about this. And then Todd said, hey, Randy, I got this guy who can write a white paper for us. Yeah, Nate wrote the first draft. And then they put their names on, edited it significantly. I saw the black and red lines. But this is how stuff starts. And all of you and Federalists or not, should be very keen to seeing how your arguments can seize at just the right moment. Because the timing of this case was perfect. The arguments against this law formed over the blogosphere in the course of a few months. I mean, not very long, something 3-4 months. That meeting at the Federal Society was November 2009, right? By March 2010, lawsuits were filed in court. So what, 4 months? Within hours after Barnett's report was released, it was read on the House floor. Senator Hatch read the report into the Congressional Record. This was the quickest citation ever of a judicial piece by Congress. And it's simply stunning. Now to go to a few other points, I think Professor Ruger's point that this changes the way we look at con law is exactly right. Doctrinally, I don't think NFPB has that much import. Yeah, Congress can't mandate an activity, they can't coerce the states, okay, but what else? But I think what this recommends for the Roberts Court is that they're willing to police the federalism bounds, right? After the Rehnquist Court, Lopez and Morrison, they kind of retreated with the Raich case, the medicinal marijuana case. And it was unclear where the Roberts Court stood on this issue. Now we know. They are going to be tough on these issues of federalism. They will be tough on making sure the federal government does what they say they do, and they can't go outside their bounds. And that, what Professor Larry Solom's called our constitutional gestalt, like the way we look at everything, has, I think, shifted. And we're now in a different space. And I think politicians should take heed of that if they ever try and do something different. Had the Affordable Care Act been passed with this understanding, I don't think they would have been so cavalier about it. And I think they might not have framed it in the same way. Maybe they would actually call it a tax, so not to have to worry about the Commerce Clause thing. Any comments?
Sure. So I'll add a couple. I think just a couple ironic points building off of what you said is first, a lot of us are trying to figure out what the doctrinal import is, or to sharpen that question, what kinds of federal statutes might now be off the table in light of the Commerce Clause holding. Interestingly, the only one that might ever have a chance of seeing the light of day that's been kicked around that actually might be in a little bit of doctrinal trouble. Turns out it's versions of Paul Ryan's Social Security privatization plan. Okay. Which says something interesting about mandates, which Josh's book aptly describes in the first chapter or two. From a baseline of kind of compulsory tax, big government spending, individual mandates look like a conservative idea. And they were first proposed by the Heritage Foundation, endorsed by Mark Pauley over at Wharton, as a way to minimally intrude in people's choices by letting them just go buy the product in the private market instead of the government takeover. So, from the point of view of no healthcare regulation, which we have for certain segments of our market, the mandate to purchase looks like more government. From the point of view of retirement income security, where we all have a huge chunk taken out of our paycheck and invested in ways where we can't control it, Paul Ryan and like-minded folks going back decades would say, no. Just take that structure away and let Americans make their own choices. But for purposes of planning, we do have to mandate that they plan ahead. Okay, so, I think this would the ruling complicates in the way that it centers on forbidding the compulsion to act and go buy a product would complicate any proposal to truly privatize Social Security and go purchase your own 401k. Second ironic point is, and here's I know I differ from Josh, is the Affordable Care Act, in a sense, got in trouble doctrinally over this federalism question, precisely because it is so thoroughly imbued with federalism values. It is, and one of the reasons it's 2,700 pages long is it delegates so much choice and, yes, burdens to states in administering both the insurance exchanges in its original design and the Medicaid expansion. Now, lots of states, again, somewhat ironically, have ceded their authority to design exchanges and staff them and control them the way they do other state agencies, have ceded that back to the federal government, kind of an ironic federalism choice. But even today, then, a lot of states are trying to figure out whether to take the Medicaid expansion, and HHS is being pretty lenient with different states in how they spend those expanded funds, suggesting that, there's a lot of work for states, even when the Affordable Care Act goes forward, I think.
Want to do some questions?
Yeah.
Questions?
Yes, sir?
There's a lot of political ramifications for imposing, that would prevent politicians from, standing behind new taxes or imposing new taxes. Do you think now legislatures might be encouraged to, enact legislation that on its face doesn't look like a tax, knowing that if it's challenged constitutionally, it will always be upheld under the taxing power anyway?
Right. So the question was, Congress passed them as a penalty. They avoided the consequences of calling it a tax. The Supreme Court said, okay, you called it a penalty, we'll consider it as a tax. It's a risk, right? So in the one sense, the court did uphold it, and you might think that this gives cover to Congress to do in the future. But on the other hand, you might think, well, the Supreme Court did it once, they're not going to be fools again and do it in another case. I think Congress, if they're going to call something, if they're going to raise taxes, you call it a tax, they shouldn't hide behind this penalty garbage. The President made a number of promises, will not raise your taxes, well, if that wasn't true. You should be able to call it what it is. And you shouldn't be able to obfuscate it. And who knows what the court will do in the future, but I think you raise a very, very good point. Yes, sir.
I guess both of you have kind of phrased the popular constitutionalism argument as kind of how, you come up with good ideas and then circumstances will end up, making them become adopted. But from a more cynical perspective, to what extent do you think that, you have these judges or politicians who are against Obamacare and they just want to pick and choose what would be most plausible? On the flip side, someone like John Roberts, who just, even if Borelli wrote a good brief, he just wanted to come up with an excuse to uphold it without doing it. So how do you differentiate kind of the more cynical explanation to the more, popular constitutionalism?
Want to go first?
Sure, I think, first of all, I'll answer your question on its own terms and then shift it a bit. I think it's extraordinarily hard to disaggregate what we might call kind of legal or jurisprudential bases for judicial opinions from others, be they political or kind of external reasoning. Political scientists have tried to regress that out, and it's incredibly difficult. I guess to shift slightly in here, drawing also on other political theory, I don't think it's illegitimate for the Supreme Court to consider non-doctrinal factors in their ruling, such as the importance of a statute or the consequential effect on American life from striking it down. I think this is a form of judicial restraint to look at, that we saw all the way. We've seen these debates go back to the New Deal era, when the New Deal, the early New Deal, the court struck down extraordinarily popular New Deal programs and then kind of realized its error and realized that whether these programs are problematic or not is a choice for the political branches. I think it's important to remember, this is the last thing I'll say, is among all the other things the court appropriately would have been aware of last summer was that a major presidential election was looming in the fall of 2012. And I think that's all the more reason for the court to leave the question to the people. They knew that Romney opposed the Affordable Care Act. They knew that Obama supported it. They knew a national election was coming up. And on such a close question, to take that question out of the political arena, in my view, would have been inappropriate.
I second everything he said. It can't be underestimated the fact that there was a presidential election. You cannot ignore that issue. And I'll one-up it. The president was not some kind of innocent bystander. Okay? He was involved in this case in many respects. So go back to 2010. Ever remember Citizens United? Ever remember the State of the Union? Ever remember how the president called the Supreme Court out for reversing the century worth of law? Ever remember Justice Alito going, no, not true? Okay. This president has shown that he's willing to engage the court on the issues with the right in front of him. 4 days after the Supreme Court conference in the healthcare cases, 4 days, the president gave an impromptu remark. He said, quote, the court should exercise their jurisprudence carefully, that they should not strike this law down. He actually warned the court of becoming a Lochner court. I think this might be the first time ever a president actually said the word Lochner in the Rose Garden. I mean, we can check this, but this might be the first time ever. I don't think George Bush had. The president was talking about Lochner to the Supreme Court. He was putting pressure, and I talk about this in my book, and it's somewhat controversial, but I think there was definitely an effort by the president to at least say, hey, court, listen, if you strike this down, this is going to be an issue in 2012. Okay? And I think it's the answer that must have weighed on John Roberts' mind when he voted to uphold the law in the manner that he did.
So I just want to quickly, I think I disagree more with Randy Barnett on this than you. You're more nuanced. But when Barnett says, this was undue pressure, I think that's crazy. I mean, in this sense, first of all, viewed historically at the way like John Marshall was burned in effigy after Marbury versus Madison, this was softball stuff. But even in the last 100 years, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt didn't just use words; he threatened to attack the court. Okay, so the phrase "sticks and stones" comes to mind. And lastly, I mean, we give judges life tenure precisely so they had insulation against this kind of political rhetoric. And whatever the influences on the court and on Roberts, I would sincerely hope that short-term criticism was not driving him.
Any questions? Anyone else?
Here's one.
Right there, sorry.
Locked.
Yeah, both of you talked a lot about this phenomenon of creativity that goes into doctrinal elaboration. But of course, at the end of the day, what the court will say is something like, this is what the words we are interpreting the words of the Constitution, and embodied in that idea of interpretation is a sort of view of a static meaning of some sort. And so to me, there's a little bit of a tension there, and I was wondering if you guys, how you guys come out. Obviously, different scholars have different positions on this. Balkan doesn't seem to be troubled by the this notion of staticness, but I was wondering what you guys personally thought about that interaction.
Well, I think there are two ways of looking at it. So we have the Constitution, right? This is a document in National Archives. That doesn't change. What does change is constitutional law, like little c, constitutional law. And the manners in which constitutional law change, as Professor River mentioned, are very dynamic. We've seen this with the same-sex marriage movement. 15 years ago, no one could have predicted this. Even 10 years ago, with Lawrence, no one could have predicted this. But it went very quickly. Even after Windsor was decided, we have New Mexico and other states. I mean, it just goes very quickly. Obamacare was even faster. In the span of 4 months, constitutional law changed, right? In the span of 4 months, what everyone thought was constitutional change, where maybe half, a large chunk of scholars, particularly on the right, said that there's a legitimate argument why this is not constitutional. And it brought up what we received a whole period of contestation, where people actually argued about constitutional norms. And I think in this fight, one side was more prepared for the fight than the other. The other side maybe had a late head start. So Jack Balkin was the few who would engage. Look at Jack Balkin debated at Penn, I think in 2009, against David Rifkin on this argument. Jack was one of the few. Most other people said, this is stupid, this is not going anywhere. So don't ever scoff at a constitutional argument that's grounded in doctrine. That's supported by a lot of people. I think that might be the important takeaway.
I would just add an interesting observation as somebody who observes Supreme Court methodology. Here, even those who want Commerce Clause restrictions on the court, the 5 justices who would have struck down the mandate, did not do so in originalist terms. The only justice who's a Commerce Clause originalist is Thomas. All of the other 4 would accept the New Deal compromise, which is thoroughly judicially made. I mean, contrast that with Heller, the individual gun rights decision, where both Stevens and Scalia, the battle was joined in explicitly historical originalist terms. It just shows that the court itself kind of does not adhere to one methodology.
Okay. Maybe time for one more question? More question? I know you have class, so.
Okay, well, let's thank our speakers. We end on the time we try to end today. The sign-in sheets that I passed out while they were talking, those are just so we can know who's here. If you don't have to put your name on or anything, we just like to have a record if we can.
Can I?
Some people look rather suspiciously at that.
Can I just plug this Wednesday? So another event jointly sponsored by Fed Society, ACS, Eastern European Law Students Association. This is a talk on media freedom in Europe and Russia by Andre Richter, who's apparently one of our 2Ls, but it's Wednesday at noon. It's in one of the Silverman upstairs rooms, but anyway, if you're interested in free speech, freedom of the media, that's another good event coming up Wednesday at noon.
Thank you. And the book we built, I'll be happy to Thank you so much.
Is it just cash or?
Cash and credit.
Okay, yeah, cash and credit.
There's no student loan money though, they don't accept that here. It's not worth it. Thank you.